specialized in humanities in Iran. It is certainly a historic moment and occasion for all of us attending this webinar, whose speaker is Professor Noam Chomsky, a genius, the great linguist of our time, an outstanding philosopher, an eminent thinker, and a passionate pacifist. In his presentation, Professor Chomsky has kindly accepted to share his current views and thoughts on the Minimalist program in 2021. The cognitive revolution, which was initiated by Noam Chomsky in mid-50s of the 20th century, gained an unprecedented momentum and soon evolved as a school known as generativism, generative enterprise, biolinguistics, formal linguistics, Cartesian linguistics, and Chomskyan revolution in linguistics. Generativism, as a school of linguistics, embraces the main Chomskyan stream as well as a number of offshoots. Some of them were, and a number of them still are, highly influential generative models of language. Today, there are a number of non-generative, non-rationalist, namely empiricist, approaches devoted to the science of language. But firstly, following the generative, or more specifically the Chomskyan paradigm and Chomsky's initiative, they all search for universals of language, though, of course, within their own philosophical orientation. And secondly, they define themselves and their approaches by comparing them with generative grammar's approach philosophically, theoretically, methodologically, and empirically. Chomsky's approach is also remarkably distinct from other rival approaches in today's linguistics in that he claims sometime maybe 60,000 years ago, language was there in its modern form without further changes. In fact, the effects of having a complex symbolic system are barely there before 60,000 to 100,000 years ago. Chomsky adds, the simplest assumption, we have no reason to doubt it, is that what happened is that we got merged. You got an operation that enables you to take mental objects or concepts of some sort already constructed and make bigger mental objects out of them. That's merge. As soon as you have that, you have an infinite variety of hierarchically structured expressions and thoughts available to you. Professor Noam Chomsky, we are eagerly waiting to listen to your talk and learn about the state of the art in the Minimalist program in 2021. I've been notified that Professor Chomsky will address our webinar for about 40 minutes. Then I will have 20 minutes for questions and comments, if I may. Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. We are eager to listen to your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege, personally, to be able to be with you today, even if only virtually. I'm particularly pleased because of the fine work that's being done in the areas that interest me at your university and at the University of Kurdistan. Excellent, outstanding investigations. So an extra reason to be very pleased to be with you today. Well, let's begin by asking the first question. what is language? There are various approaches to this. There is a traditional view that holds that the core property of language is that it is the source of our thoughts. In modern terms, that would mean that the language generates thoughts roughly in this manner in which your some internal system coded in your brain generates all possible arithmetical properties, multiplication table, for example. Then you can access them in one way or another. Same idea, the language generates thoughts. One way or another, you can access them in what you and I are now doing, producing them, internalizing them when you hear them. There's a second view, a modern, very modern view, which holds that the core property of language is that it's an instrument of communication, a more complicated version of animal communication systems, radically different from the traditional view, which of course recognizes that language is used for communication, as are many other things we do, but that has no counterpart in the rest of the animal world. I should start off by saying that the traditional view seems to me on the right track. There's mounting evidence that, in fact, language is fundamentally structured as a system of thought with its uses for communication, telling jokes, whatever else we do with it, as kind of a side property, ancillary property. This, I should say, is entirely compatible with modern evolutionary biology. Been made clear. First of all, it's obvious from looking at the content, but it's also it's not a commonplace, commonly accepted by leading evolutionary biologists like Nobel laureates in evolutionary biology, Salvador Luria and François Jacob, to mention just two. Well, let me try to spell out the basis for these conclusions, which I think essentially support the traditional view that language is the source of thought, and in modern terms, a system for generating thoughts. So let's begin by asking, what are thoughts? There are views on this topic by leading thinkers. Alan Turing, one of the founders of the modern theory of computation, the founder of artificial intelligence, author of a famous paper which initiated the field called Can Machines Think? And he says in the paper that the question whether machines can think, is too meaningless to deserve discussion because we have no independent concept of thought. Right at about the same time, Liechtenstein, whose seminars Turing was in fact attending, in his aphoristic style, said about this that humans think, maybe dolls and spirits. His way of saying, the way we use the term thinking, we apply it to something that humans do. And since words have a kind of open texture, they're free to be used in somewhat metaphoric ways. We can extend the usage to things that we conceive of as being like us in certain respects. But it's not a factual question whether dogs think. It's a question of choice, like whether airplanes fly. Some languages yes, some languages no. But there's no substantive issue. So thinking is something that humans do. We can try to characterize it. Turing himself said, as far as he knows, thinking is just some kind of buzzing in the head. Well, we can do better than that by now. We can spell out some of the properties of what the buzzing in the head is, at least for that component of thought that is formulated in human language, the one component of thought that we have any clear grasp of. Let me make clear that the thought generated by human language is not inner speech. Inner speech is different phenomena. The actual thought that's going on is inaccessible to us by introspection, just as inaccessible as the workings of our second major neurological system. There's another brain, the enteric nervous system, huge nervous system, sometimes called the gut brain. It works to keep the body functioning. We can study it from the outside. We can't introspect into what it's doing. And actually the workings of the first brain, this one, are about the same. We can't introspect into it. Inner speech is telling us something quite different. I'll return to that. Well, let's begin by looking at some of the quite surprising, remarkable properties of language. Some of these were recognized at the origins of the modern scientific revolution in the 17th century. Galileo, his contemporaries, created a fundamental new scientific revolution, mainly by willing to be puzzled. Their predecessors, neo-scholastic philosophers and scientists, had a fairly rich descriptive science, but it was descriptive. They had answers, but the answers to questions, but the answers didn't mean much. So why does a rock fall and steam rise? Because they're moving to their natural place, things like that. Galileo and his contemporaries were not satisfied. They were puzzled by the question, why does a rock fall? Why does it fall at a certain rate? And so on. And that's the origin of the modern scientific revolution. Willingness to be puzzled about ordinary phenomena is a talent that should be cultivated. Little children have it, worth keeping all your life. Well, language did not escape their attention. Galileo and other contemporaries were amazed and awed by what they saw as a most astonishing fact, that with a few symbols, our minds can construct infinitely many thoughts and can even convey to others who have no access to our minds the inner workings of our thinking. They regard it as one of the most astonishing phenomena of nature. Galileo himself described the invention of the alphabet, which gives a way of recording this, as the most stupendous invention in human history. Well, I think their amazement was very much on target, very much correct. We should be amazed by this phenomenon, seek to understand it. And there were efforts in the years that followed, what were called general and rational grammar, to try to explicate at least some aspects of this mystery. It's called general grammar because they were hoping that it would apply to all languages. Rational grammar because it was seeking explanations, not just descriptions of phenomena. Well, this continued into the 19th century, later was swept aside by structuralist behaviorist currents, didn't have these interests, and it was forgotten, revived in the 20th century. Come back to that in a moment. These same concerns are a large factor of what led René Descartes to establish his famous dualist conception of the nature of the world. There's two substances, one matter, body, physical, the material world. A second one, res cogitans, the thinking substance, which has quite different properties, cannot be absorbed within the mechanical world. And a key part of the reason for the res cogitans was exactly the property of language that I just described, sometimes called the creative aspect of language use, the capacity which all normal people have to construct in the mind infinite number of thoughts and to produce them on occasion in a way which is appropriate to circumstances, but not caused by circumstances. As the Cartesians put it, we may be incited and inclined to speak in certain ways, but we're not impelled. This element of freedom of choice for appropriate use is something unique. It's a unique property, he felt, unique to humans, which is associated with the ability to construct this infinite number of thoughts in our mind. Well, Isaac Newton followed shortly after, and he basically demolished the theory, but we should understand how. He had nothing to say about mind. He thought Descartes' theory of mind looked quite sound. What he destroyed was the theory of body. He showed there are no physical objects that have the character assumed by the founders of modern science, what was called the mechanical philosophy. Mechanical objects, kind of like the complex artifacts that highly talented, skilled artisans were producing all over Europe at the time. The world is just a bigger artifact of that kind. Newton showed that cannot be true. Means there's no mind-body problem in the traditional sense, not because there's anything wrong with the mind, but because there's no body. All we can do is try to construct the best theories that we can, whatever entities they postulate. That's all we can say about what's real. John Locke, shortly after Newton's Principia came out, within a few years, drew the obvious conclusion, known in the history of philosophy as Locke's hypothesis, that thinking is just a property of some organized component of matter. That's all we can say about it. That was then studied extensively through the 18th century, and as far as early Darwin. Then it too was forgotten completely, rediscovered in the late 20th century as what's sometimes called an astonishing hypothesis, a radical new idea in the philosophy of mind and in the neurosciences, namely the idea that thinking is a property of some organized system in the brain. Basically what the standard view of the 18th century repeated now in almost the same words. Well, there's another traditional view, that traditional idea that had never really taken fire, but has to be rediscovered. That's Aristotle's distinction between possession of knowledge and use of knowledge, generation versus production. In modern terms, competence and performance. That was almost totally forgotten. all the years, the millennia that followed, there were studies of performance, use of knowledge, but not of competence, possession of knowledge, was revived with the modern theory of computation, Turing, other great mathematicians, which made a sharp distinction between the internal program that generates an infinite set and whatever you do to access that. Generative grammar essentially followed from the modern theory of computation, the theory of generation and competence associated with various ideas about how the knowledge you have is used. Well, assuming Locke's hypothesis, language is based on organized structures in the brain, we then proceed to ask, how do we develop theories of this? And there are theories at two levels. One of them has to do with the faculty of language itself. We want to know, what is that faculty? Apparently a species property, common to all humans, apart from severe pathology, and it seems unique to humans. There doesn't seem to be any analog in the rest of the animal world. That's one reason, incidentally, why it's hard to study. So take human vision. We know quite a lot about it, about the basic neuroscience, that's the neurology that lies behind it. We know this because of experimental work with similar animals, cats and monkeys. Rightly or wrongly, we have allowed ourselves to do invasive experimentation on these animals, which has determined with great refinement how even the individual neurons in the visual system respond to various kinds of visual stimuli. What happens if you deprive a kitten of structured patterns in early infancy, and many other things. And since humans have essentially the same visual system, we know a lot about human vision. Can't do that with language. There's no other animal to investigate. So investigation has to be much more skilled, roundabout, looking from the outside. But there is a great deal that you can learn in this way. That's one level of theory, the theory of the faculty of language. Today it's often called UG, universal grammar, new sense of a traditional term. There's a second level of explanation, that's particular languages. I would like to know lots of questions, lots of what are the properties of Tagalog, Swahili, Farsi, whatever you're looking at. Well, an explanatory theory of a language is, in fact, a generative grammar, a recursive procedure for generating the structures of the language, their interpreters, the thought that they express, and the ways in which they can be externalized into usually sound, but could be some other medium. In fact, the medium that you use to externalize what's internal to you is sort of like a printer that's used by your laptop. The laptop can have a program, say for arithmetic multiplication, doesn't care what printer you use. And language seems to be rather similar. The internal program generates thoughts. You can use speech, you can use vision, sign languages, virtually identical with spoken language in its internal nature. You can even use touch, because any sensory modality, just as the computer can use any printer. So we have two levels of explanation. One, try to construct the best generative grammar for each particular language. And at a deeper level, study UG, try to find the theory of the faculty of language. Well, as soon as we do that, we run into a problem. If we are regarding language as a trait of humans, that is an organic property, has to meet the theory, UG, has to meet several conditions. One condition is learnability. The theory has to account for how an infant, from scattered evidence, can attain the knowledge that it possesses. Second condition is evolvability. UG had to evolve. How did that happen? Third problem is universality. Has to be common to all languages, despite their apparent extreme variety. That's a conundrum. These conditions seem to conflict with one another. For learnability, the theory has to be rich enough to make the leap from very restricted evidence to very rich knowledge. And very quickly, we now know that by 2 or 3 years old, long before a child is producing anything very much, it's already mastered remarkable properties of its language. Experimental work has shown that. Statistical studies of what's available to the child have now shown that the input is extremely limited. So you have, on the one hand, you have to assume a theory rich enough to account for this tremendous gap. You look at evolvability, you draw the opposite conclusion. There's pretty good evidence now that human language evolved pretty much along with humans. It's roughly 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. Before that, there's no significant evidence in the archaeological record of any serious symbolic activity. We now know from genomic studies that humans began to separate at least 150,000 years ago, and they share the same language faculty. That's not long after humans appear on Earth, roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. In evolutionary time, these are instants, flicks of an eye. So it seems that something happened, some small rewiring of the brain, which pretty much along with modern humans gave rise to our language faculty. Now, that implies that it should be very simple. So we have a conflict. Learnability suggests should be very rich. Evolvability suggests should be very simple and limited. And in the background lurks this problem of universality. These are the kinds of problems that have sort of shaped the study of the theory of the generative enterprise, the theory of the nature of language. They've become much sharper in recent years because of the recent discoveries that I've just mentioned. So it turns out within the minimalist program in the last few years, there are ways arising that seem to offer a solution to the conundrum. I'll talk about that now. Let's begin by looking at what it is that a 2 or 3-year-old knows. Some of these things are pretty remarkable. It's now been demonstrated that by 30 months old, maybe even earlier, infants already know the fundamental principle of what's called structure dependence. A remarkable and surprising fact about language. The operations of language do not pay any attention to the linear order of words or other surface structural arrangements. They only operate on abstract structures. We see that in very simple examples. So suppose just take ordinary conjunction. 2 boys and a girl are hurting themselves. Why don't we say 2 boys and a girl is hurting herself? That's a very simple computation. It says that the copula B will agree with the closest noun adjacent to it. So 2 boys and a girl should say is, not are. But we don't do that. We say are, not is. You see the same in slightly more complicated cases. So suppose I say, the man who fixed the car carefully packed his tools. Ambiguous. Could mean fixed the car carefully packed his tools. Suppose you put carefully in the front. Carefully, the man who fixed the car packed his tools. No ambiguity. It just means fixed his tools. That means that carefully does not find the noun, the verb phrase that's closest to it, but looks for the more remote one, the one farther away, not fix the car, but pack the tools. Every infant knows this, as I say, 30 months. And it's quite astonishing when you think about it. It means the child, the infant, is ignoring 100% of what it hears, which is all linear order. It's not using cognitive processes that are well within its cognitive repertoire, like picking the next red bead on a string, say, easy. Not using any of those. What the child is attending to is things it never hears, but that its mind constructs, structures in the mind. And this happens to be universal for all languages. Well, obviously unlearnable. There's no evidence for it. It must be innate, must be part of our fundamental nature, part of UG, and we have to ask ourselves what it is. That's a deep problem of language, for which we now have an answer. Why is there order altogether? Why do we string words out one after the other? Well, that's not a property of language. That's a property of the sensory motor system, the printer. The articulatory organs just can't produce structures. They can only produce things one after another. So the printer is, if you like, defective. It doesn't work well for language, but that's what we have. Actually, sign language uses slightly richer properties because visual space offers other options. But these are basically not the linear order structure arrangements are really not basically properties of language. They're properties of an amalgam of language and some sensory motor system which has no relation to language. Existed long before language appeared and hasn't changed since language arrived. Well, that gives us a way to look at one of the parts of the conundrum, the apparent variation of languages. It seems the more we investigate that the surface variety of languages does not have to do with the inner system that's generating thoughts. It has to do with the externalization to a sensory motor medium. That seems to be the locus of variety, mutability, complexity. So that's not really part of core language. It's part of the association of language with external systems that have nothing to do with language. We look back to the internal language itself, the thought-generating system. Can't prove this yet, but it's more and more looks like it's the case that it's virtually uniform among humans. It's just part of our nature. Well, going back to the explanation for structure dependence, notice that the problem of learnability doesn't arise. The problem of variety doesn't arise. The only problem is evolvability. So what we want to show is that structure dependence could have easily evolved within the conditions of human evolution. And in fact, there's an answer to that. Structure dependence follows automatically from the simplest computational procedure, one which has to exist for an infinite generative system to exist at all. Technically, binary set formation, it's called merge in modern usage. Well, no problem of evolvability, no problem of learnability, no problem of variety. We have an explanation for one of the most fundamental, most surprising properties of human language. That's the perfect result, perfect explanation. First time in the history of long, rich study of language that there have been any true explanations. Well, let's look a little further. We look at merge, the simplest computational operation. It's evident at once that there's basically two kinds. The two elements that are merged can be distinct from one another, or one can be part of the other. What's called external and internal merge. And both apply in the formation of sentences. So if I say, John read the book, putting the pieces together by external merge. Instead of the book, I could have put which book. John read which book. But then you have the option, and some languages you do it, others not, of taking the phrase which book, which is part of the thing you've generated, and merging it with the whole thing, internal merge. Then you get which book, John read which book. Notice you don't lose the original which book. The ear doesn't hear it because efficiency conditions in externalization say, don't bother pronouncing everything, just pronounce the least you can. But the internal system receives it. And that shows up very quickly in understanding of sentences. So if I say, the boys expect the girls to like each other, it means the girls like each other. Words like each other, so-called anaphors, find the closest antecedent. So the girls, not the boys. I suppose I say, which girls do the boys expect to like each other? Each other doesn't find the closest antecedent, which the boys. It finds the remote antecedent, which girls. It's the girls you're expecting to like each other, even though you don't pronounce it. The point is that what the brain is seeing is which girls the boys expect which girls to like each other. What the ear is hearing is which girls the boys expect to like each other. But the brain doesn't pay any attention to that. It's looking at what's internally generated. That we can't introspect into that, but we have evidence for it, like what I just mentioned, and tons more. Well, that's a famous property of language. It's called displacement with reconstruction. Linguists will recognize this. It's always been considered a major problem. Why does language bother with the displacement? What are these complicated rules of reconstruction? When you look at it from the point of view of the minimalist program, there's no problem. The brain is simply hearing the sentence with which girls in the position of the closest antecedent, and the internal merge just comes free. It's the simplest operation, in fact. Involves the least computation. So all of this is exactly what you expect. Displacement and reconstruction are not a problem. We have a perfect solution to them. Going back to inner speech, notice that inner speech is not inner. When you say the sentence to yourself, you use the externalized form.